Maybe our keynote speaker can help me understand the economy. I had the pleasure of riding in with her from the airport. Marcy Rossell speaks on the nexus of economics, politics, culture, and the media. Her animated style was honed when she served as the popular Lively chief economist for CNBC in the months immediately following September 11th. Prior to her career in broadcast journalism, Marcy served as corporate economist and investment spokesperson for Oppenheimer Funds. Next screen. Before moving to Wall Street, she was an expert witness for Deloitte & Touche in court cases involving economic issues. Marcy began her career as an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. She earned a PhD in economics from SMU, where she was named one of the young alumni of 2002. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome former CNBC economist and Squawk Box host, Dr. Marcy Rossell.
Thank you so much. Wendy sort of noticed that my bio was a little on the long side, and you might look at me and say, well, that woman doesn't really look old enough to have had all those jobs, right? And really what it means is I just can't hold down a job. That really is what it means. Thank you so much for bringing me to Charleston for the first time. Really pleasure to be here with you today. Pleasure to be here with those of you who are joining us via live stream on the internet. It's really nice to see your industry kind of embrace the internet and give people a way to join us without actually having to make the trip to South Carolina, even though it's actually one of the most fantastic places I've always been. I was walking around and I realized, this is like combining two of my favorite places. It's like taking Disney World and mashing it up with New Orleans and kind of cleaning out a little bit of the grime, and boom, you get Charleston, South Carolina. Absolutely fantastic. Today, my remarks are going to be sort of all kind of drawn together around a single common theme. And that theme I'll share with you in just a minute, but when my kids were little, I've got 22-year-old twins right now. Twins just turned 22, girls. But when they were small, when they were tiny, one of my absolute favorite times of the day would be when Sesame Street would come on. Even you got little kids, remember when Sesame Street would come on? Because when Sesame Street would come on, for a precious 30 minutes, my children would be still. And they wouldn't destroy anything in the house for just these precious 30 minutes. But for me personally, my favorite part of a Sesame Street sort of show every single day was that they had a letter of the day. Remember they would have a letter of the day they would go through? Well, we're actually going to have a letter of the day. That's sort of the theme that unites everything I'm going to talk about. We're going to have a letter of the day, and the letter of the day is going to be E. Letter E. We're going to talk today about Europe. Starts with an E, not with a U. When we talk about the U.S. economy, we're going to talk about two E's. We're going to talk about exports. Starts with an E, not with an X. We're going to talk about employment. There's also an E. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up my remarks with just a little bit of commentary, because I can't help myself, on the election. Talk a little bit about the election, too. So let's get started with what's going on in Europe. Because for those of you who have been in the industry for quite some time, you'll realize that we're going through the third financial crisis in 15 years. This is the third financial crisis of my career. I had a different color hair when this all started. I'm getting kind of tired of this. I don't know about you guys. But in order to understand the crisis that's unfolding very slowly, this financial crisis is unfolding a little bit slower than the Asian financial crisis of '97 and the sort of typical financial crisis that we all think of now, 2008, the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. This third, what I'll call the European financial crisis, it's unfolding a little bit more slowly than the other ones that we experienced in the late 90s and just 3-4 years ago. In order to understand it, you need some historical perspective on it. Now, in order to get some historical perspective on it, I think you have to go way back. You have to go way back to the late 1980s. In fact, you have to go back to 1989 to truly understand the events that are unfolding in Europe today. So let's go all the way back to 1989 and think about the world as it was in 1989. I was a young college student studying at Southern Methodist University, and I was studying business and economics. I was a student back in 1989. In 1989, what was considered to be the world's strongest economy? Does anybody remember? It wasn't the United States. That's right. It was Japan. When I went to business school back in the late 1980s, everybody told me, young lady, if you're going to be a businesswoman in the next century, you are going to need to learn to speak Japanese. Do you remember that? Can you imagine how bad my hillbilly Japanese would have been? I'm so glad I did not take that advice, because in 1989, the Tokyo stock market peaked. To this very day, it is still 75% of its peak value. To this very day, it's never recovered. Remember, they were selling real estate by the inch in Tokyo proper, in downtown Tokyo, in 1989. We were all going to work for Sony. Remember that? And they were going to take over. That was 1989. And the reason I'm sort of sharing that with you, if you're all worried about China taking over, remember Japan, okay? Do not encourage your children to go learn Mandarin or any of the other many languages that they speak in China, okay? Wasting their time, because I can assure you they can buy the little Rosetta Stone English thing and learn it just as quickly. So don't waste your time. Japan in 1989, world's strongest economy. What about the United States? Well, the United States was mired in the Cold War still in 1989. We were still sort of going through the Cold War, experiencing that. We had emerged from the dreadful economic decade that was the 1970s, the high inflation, the high interest rates, the high unemployment rates. We had 9 years of pretty decent stock market growth, but the United States was kind of somewhere in the middle, because we were still fighting with Russia, remember? Russia, who in 1989 was withdrawing from Afghanistan after 10 long years of trying to dominate that country. Didn't work for them, did it? It's pretty funny how history sort of repeats itself, doesn't it? Whenever I hear U.S. politicians say, we're going to leave Afghanistan just as soon as we can sort of teach them how to fight. And I'm thinking to myself, I think they know how to fight. I'm just watching them, and I think maybe we might learn how to fight from them, but they look to me like they really know what they're doing. So we're good there. What about Europe? In 1989, Europe was mired in what we called Eurosclerosis. Anybody who was a business school student at that point who remembers Eurosclerosis? Eurosclerosis characterized what we knew then as Western Europe, because Eastern Europe in 1989 was still behind the Iron Curtain. They were still behind the Iron Curtain in 1989. So in 1989, Europe's economies were characterized by a bloated public sector, high taxes, heavy regulation, inflexible labor markets. And we sort of wrapped that all together and called it Eurosclerosis. Sounds awful, doesn't it? Like, who would want that? But in 1989, in the fall of 1989, something quite remarkable happened. In the fall of 1989, I was actually studying abroad. I was a college student, and I was studying abroad in Denmark in 1989. I was studying what then was known as East-West business relations, something that very rapidly disappeared in the 1990s, but there was something called East-West business relations. I was a study abroad student. For those of you who have college students, let me tell you something. It is no longer study abroad, it is drinking abroad, okay? They are going there for a 4-month vacation to drink and pick up a couple of classes that they're gonna get a pass-fail grade in. All right, does everybody understand this, that you're paying for your kids to go on vacation? But back when I went, we actually did a little bit of studying, and we took a study tour to what was then East Berlin. I drove through Checkpoint Charlie. They looked underneath our buses to see if anybody was hiding up underneath there, took our passports, came onto the bus, the whole thing. 3 weeks after I went through Checkpoint Charlie, something remarkable happened. The Berlin Wall fell like that. Do you guys remember 1989 when the Berlin Wall just came down? Like, if you weren't paying attention, you missed it. It just happened that quickly. And the history, the economic and the political history of the Western world changed in front of our eyes in a short couple of months. Very, very quickly. Now, the reason that's important for our story today is this. When the Berlin Wall fell and Germany was reunified, 2 things occurred. Number 1, the reunification of East Germany and West Germany created, right in the center of Europe, a massive export-oriented powerhouse economy right in the middle of Europe. So if you think about what's going on today and why Germany is dominating the economic discussions that's going on, it's because that experience, whether you took old East Germany and West Germany and put them together, when you did that, you created a huge industrial, export-oriented powerhouse economy right in the middle of Europe. The second thing that the reunification of Germany accomplished was it lit a fire underneath the Euro project. Now see, the idea of a single currency for Europe, it'd been around since the 1950s. It wasn't a new idea in the 90s. It had been around since the 1950s when policymakers in Western Europe said one way that we could politically unify and hopefully prevent things like World War I and World War II from happening again is we could undertake massive political unification. That's what they were going after. And the way that we would unify politically is we would adopt a common currency. The common currency, by the way, would be one step on the road to political unification. It'd be one step on the road. But the reunification of Germany in the late 80s, early 90s lit a fire under the single currency project. Now, the Maastricht Treaty was fully enforced by 1992. Took 8 years to create the European Central Bank and the common currency, okay? It was a long-term project. So this idea that we're going to solve Europe's problems in a year is ridiculous. It took 8 years to create the common currency. But what's most sort of important for our story today, if you sort of think about it, this sort of creation of the common currency, what we need to understand today is this. Back in the 90s, there were many economists, one in particular, Mundell, who won a Nobel Prize, second one, Martin Feldstein, who came out and said, the euro will never work. It's not going to work, and here's why. Europe is not an optimal currency area. Europe is not an optimal currency area. Now, when the economists came out and said this, guess what? They didn't get invited back to next year's conference. It was absolutely remarkable. If you were an economist who came out in Europe and said, you know, this is never going to work, they would not put you on the program next year. But Europe's not an optimal currency area, and here's why. There are 4 important conditions for an optimal currency area. Number 1, capital and labor, money and people, have to be able to move freely within an optimal currency area. So if you think about the United States, we have people here probably from just about all 50 states, I would guess. And if you want to visit, say, Arkansas, where my family is from, do I need a passport? My husband says I probably should get a passport to visit a place like Arkansas, that we really should have our own sort of passport. But I don't need a passport, do I? Just go, right? No border checks or anything like that. Likewise, I can bank all over the United States. I can go to an ATM, and even though my account was opened in Virginia, I can get money out of an ATM here in South Carolina, right? So money and people move freely within an optimal currency area. And you can legislate that, and Europe legislated that and said, we're going to have freedom of movement and freedom of people. That's not hard. Second thing, though, that you need your business cycle in an optimal currency area. You need your business cycle to always move in the same way. So what that means is, like, think about the United States. If there is a recession taking place in, say, New York, chances are there's going to be a recession going on in Mississippi as well, because there's always a recession going on in Mississippi. But in the United States, in general, the economy looks very similar across the entire United States. If one area is booming, chances are another is going to be booming too. If one area is in recession, chances are another is going to be in recession. Now, that's not true in Europe. Think about just how different the economies of the Scandinavian countries look from Greece, Italy, Portugal. They look very different. Now, this problem is not insurmountable if you have the ability to do the third condition I want to discuss, and that is in the ability to make physical transfers from rich areas to poor areas. Because if you think about it, in the United States, huge physical transfers from states like New York, Illinois, New Jersey, and Connecticut to the tune of between 5 and 10% of their federal tax dollars get sent out of the states every single year to places where people talk like I do. Arkansas, Mississippi, West Virginia. Those states all are net beneficiaries of federal tax dollars every year. And this is the sticking point for Europe. They have no formal mechanism to collect taxes at a federal level and redistribute money away from Germany and the richer countries to the poor states of Greece, Spain, and Italy. They don't have a formal mechanism. They don't have a way to do it. Everything's kind of hodgepodge, and they've been sort of putting Band-Aids on it. Now, could they come up with one? Sure, they could. How long do you think it'll take, though? Because every time I see them sort of going to their conferences and having these summit meetings, it looks to me like they're just drinking wine, men kissing men, hugging, walking out and saying, we plan to come up with the plan. That's pretty much all they've said. Oh, we plan to come up with the plan. But you see, I don't actually believe they'll ever be able to come up with a plan that will keep the Eurozone together in the form that it is today for the following reason. They do not satisfy the fourth condition, the most important condition, the one that you cannot legislate, the one you can't make rules around. They do not satisfy the fourth condition, and that is, in order to be an optimal currency area, you must share a common destiny and a common identity. You must. So if you think about in the United States, I took a trip to Rome 2 weeks ago. It was my husband's 50th birthday. So I took him to Rome. We went to the Vatican. And when people asked me where I was from, if they couldn't figure out where I was from, what do you think I would tell them? I didn't say I was from Arkansas, because they wouldn't know where that is. I said, I'm from the United States, right? Because that's what I identify with. I don't identify with being an Arkansan. I identify with being an American. Somebody asks me where I am, I say I'm an American. If someone from Europe comes to the United States and you say, where are you from? What do they tell you? Do they say, I'm a European? No. They say, I'm from Greece. They say, I'm from Germany. If they're from France, they don't talk to you. But if they did, they would say I was French. That's what they do. You see, they do not have a sense of a common destiny. They do nationally, but they certainly don't have one across Europe. And because of that, there is no way that they are going to get around politically the problem of the very large transfers of dollars that it would take to keep their union together. So, what does it mean for us? It means a very volatile summer. It means lurching from one short-term solution to the next. It means extremely volatile financial markets. It's not fun, I got to tell you. But you know what? And I say this over and over again. I do not worry about the train wreck that I can see coming. Does everybody get that? I don't worry about the train wreck I see coming. Do you remember Y2K? Did you guys have a plan for Y2K? Who still got bottled water in their basement, right? Did you go out and get a generator too? Yeah, that was me. See, we don't have to worry about the train wrecks we see coming. If you are a CEO of a financial institution in the United States and you don't have a plan for the breakup of Europe, you deserve whatever you get. Seriously. Anybody here work for a company where you don't think that they're planning and have insulated themselves and hedged against the breakup of the euro? It's a train wreck we've seen coming for 2 years, particularly in the United States. The evidence suggests that U.S. financial companies are fairly well insulated against a breakup of the euro. So if it's not through the financial contagion channel that Europe's breakup might get us, how else could it hurt us? Well, the other way that it could hurt us, and this gets us to the U.S. economy, is through exports. U.S. exports to the rest of the world, because Europe's a pretty big trading partner, right? They're a pretty big trading partner, and if they get poorer, then they will stop buying our stuff. So if they stop buying our stuff, that might be bad for us, right? Well, I wanted to get a sense of just how important a trading partner Europe was. So when I actually started digging around in the numbers, I looked specifically at one area of exports that's extremely important in the United States that a lot of people overlook. They overlook. If you look, agricultural products are an enormous market in the United States. They're huge. And when I actually looked at all the wheat, corn, rice, soybeans, cotton that the U.S. produces and sells to the rest of the world, last year it was $138 billion worth. It's a lot. What was the number one market? Where did we sell all that food to? Anybody want to guess? It wasn't Europe. That's exactly right. It was China. $20 billion worth of ag exports went to China. Now, what makes that number even more remarkable is 10 years ago, it was $2 billion. So in 10 short years, China's exports that they get from us. See, what do we always focus on? We focus on what we buy from them. We focus on all the cheap stuff that fills up my garage and seems to make everybody upset when I don't understand why I can't just go and buy as much cheap crap as I possibly want. How is this hurting me? How is this hurting me, right? But somebody seems to think this is hurting me. It's not hurting me. And we forget that even though the U.S. is an enormous destination for Chinese exports, they buy a lot of our stuff too. A lot of our stuff. They've become our single biggest trading partner, most important in both directions. Second, market for U.S. ag exports, Canada. Does Canada get any love? Never. They're extremely important, and we just forget they even exist. $19 billion goes to Canada. That's right. Do we have one Canadian in the room? Bless you. 2 or 3. That's right. They emptied Canada out and sent them all to down here. Okay, yeah, you guys need to get home. Somebody needs to be watching the fort, right? Third destination for U.S. exports, that would be Mexico. Also doesn't get a whole lot of love. We all talk about how they steal our jobs. Yeah, you know what? They buy a lot of our food, too. Fourth, Japan. They fall way down on the list. Finally, fifth largest, there's Europe. It accounts for about 13% of U.S. ag exports, which is reflective of where they stand across the board with all of our exports. They're not that important of a trading partner, not nearly as important as they used to be. So, if it's exports that I'm worried about, why would I be worried about exports? Because, some of you might be looking out there and saying, well, what's the big deal with exports? We don't make anything, we don't sell anything anyway. Not true. If you actually look at the U.S. economy, this recovery, the recovery that's taken place since 2008, right? We had a recession 2008, 2009. Boom, the economy has recovered fully, by the way, from that recession. Last quarter, recovers fully from that recession. What's been driving the recovery this time around? Typically, it's housing. Has housing driven this recovery? No, definitely not. In fact, it's been an enormous drag on the economy. What's driven this recovery, what has accounted for the bulk of the growth in this recovery has been exports to the rest of the world. It's been exports to the rest of the world, which is kind of curious, right? Because we always talk about what other people sell us. We never think about what we sell them. Now, any guesses as to why our exports to the rest of the world have been driving our growth? It doesn't have anything to do with the U.S. dollar and the behavior of the dollar. What matters when you get ready to sell something, no matter what? What's the single most important determinant of how much you're going to sell? How much money your customers have, how wealthy they are. That's it. Do you want rich customers or poor customers? I'm just wondering. Does anybody here reaching out to the low net worth customer? You going for that much? No, I didn't think so. My guess is if you work for a financial firm, you know that all the talk for the last decade has been about nothing more than the high net worth customer. Do you want rich customers or poor customers? You want rich ones because they buy stuff from you. The same is true when it comes to international trade. The reason that exports have driven U.S. growth over the last 4 years is the rest of the world has gotten a lot wealthier, particularly in places like Brazil, China, India. See, they didn't have a financial crisis. They kind of sailed right through it. Brazil likes to have financial crises, and they just missed this one entirely. They just sat the whole thing out. They just grew right through it. They had their financial crisis back in the 1990s. They cleaned themselves up then. In fact, this has been the first global recession where the number of poor people, truly poor people, people living on less than $1 a day, that's how the global poverty standard is defined. This is the first recession that the number of people living on less than $1 a day did not increase. Poverty on a global scale during the past recession, extreme global poverty actually declined over the last 5 years. It was remarkable. Our customers got wealthier, and they actually helped us. This is why when anybody starts talking about making China a currency manipulator, I'm like, shut up. Don't talk like that, okay? Let me buy as much cheap crap as I want to from them and fill up my garage and my storage facilities with as much of that stuff as I possibly can hold, and let them keep buying our exports, because they're doing it. They're doing quite a bit of it. So, not too exposed to the export channel either. But this leaves us with a puzzle, doesn't it? Because one of the interesting things that Colleen pointed out in her presentation was that 21% of firms don't plan on expanding their teams, or they do plan on, just 21%, which means the other 79% don't. Is that right? Or did I do that math right? I mean, I'm supposed to have a PhD in economics, but doing math on stage is not easy, okay? I think I got those numbers right. A whole bunch of them don't plan on expanding their teams. Did I get those numbers correct? Was that right? Okay, got it correct. So I told you already that the U.S. economy, in terms of production, is back to where they were. And that's what your numbers showed, too, that in terms of production, the number of meetings, all of that, you're beyond where you were in 2006. And so is the U.S. economy. In terms of activity, we're back up to where we were before. But what about employment? Not seeing it, which gets us to that other E, doesn't it? The one that people really care about, which are jobs. Because if you look, prior to the recession, the unemployment rate in this country was about 5%. What's the unemployment rate today? 8. Yeah, 8. So it used to be, so the economy's back to where it was before in terms of production, but the unemployment rate is much higher. What's going on? Like these two things you see that they don't reconcile. They don't fit. This is a puzzle. This is a paradox. Well, when I look at the economy, I think there are two things going on that explain why we are not back to where we should be in terms of job creation. First of all, productivity is higher for your industry and for every industry. Exports, by the way, export-oriented industries, things like agriculture, things like manufacturing, they tend to be capital-intensive, not labor-intensive. This is a labor-intensive business. This is a people business. My dad's a farmer in Arkansas. He and my brother farm over 1,000 acres with 2 people and a little help for some day laborers they get from down at the local county jail. Apparently they're very motivated. It's stunning. But it's a capital-intensive business, right? He has big tractors, and that pretty much does everything. Export-oriented businesses tend to be capital-intensive. So when a politician tells you we're going to increase exports and bring back the jobs, which they all say it's not, I love increasing exports, but exports don't create jobs. They don't. They're capital-intensive. They're not labor-intensive businesses. So don't believe that, because we're going to get to the election in just a minute. And they're both going to tell you that, by the way. No, doesn't happen. But there are a couple other things going on. Another thing that's going on when it comes to employment is that the unemployment rate is not evenly distributed across all groups. It's not evenly distributed across all groups. In fact, the real problem with unemployment in this country right now is unemployment among young people. It's unemployment among young people. When you actually dig through the numbers and look at it, the unemployment rate in this country is 8% for everybody. That's the average. Do you know what it is for people between the ages of 20 and 24, which I'm looking around, and I've already told you, I have 22-year-old twins, so I got 2 of them. I know there's some other people in this room who have kids, and you're wondering, why don't they get a job? Well, here's the reason they don't get a job, because the unemployment rate for them is 13%. It's not just them, although it is a little bit them, which I'll get to in just a minute. Because Lord knows by now you figured out, when I saw those Occupy Wall Street kids, did I have fun with that or what? Because there they are out camping, having a good time. They're mad about something, but they don't exactly know what. They're just mad. Doesn't it just sound like them? Anybody's got a 20-something-year-old. I'm like, can you articulate for me exactly why you're upset? No! They cannot. And as soon as it got cold, what did they do? Packed up their tents and moved back into their parents' basements. It was remarkable. Remarkable. But you know what? They got a reason to be mad, actually. The unemployment rate for them is 13%. And when the media covers unemployment in this country, if you're a journalist and you want to write a story about unemployment, you don't typically look at the 25-year-old that's lost their job. Who do you pick? You pick somebody who's 55 years old, close to retirement, doesn't have any prospects. That's a sad story. And it evokes something in people because they go, oh my God, I don't want that to be me. That makes for very interesting journalism, but it doesn't really reflect the problem of unemployment in this country, and here's why. The unemployment rate for people 55 and over is 6%. It's 6% for people 55 and older, and I know some of you in this room, including myself, are going, oh, thank God, right? For us, it's 55. If you're 55 and older, the unemployment rate that you're facing is 6%, which ain't great, but it's not 8%, and it's definitely not 13%, which is what your children are facing. Now, why are they unemployed? Well, if you've got kids that age, one of the reasons you know they're unemployed is because they can't do anything, and they're actually destructive in the workplace. It really is just the truth, isn't it? If you've ever employed someone that age, they'll file things away and you'll never see them again. It's just really, it's true. If you have an automobile and a young person drives it, my 99 Ford Expedition has scratches down both sides of it where my teenage kids literally destroyed it. And you're thinking, why doesn't that woman just buy a new car? And the answer is because it is paid for. It has nothing but liability insurance on it. And I've told every one of those kids, if you destroy it, I will not buy another one because I can afford to take a cab or a car service anywhere I want to go. And you cannot. They ding the crap out of it, but get this, nobody told it. Nobody told it. It was absolutely remarkable. They have low human capital. If you actually want to talk about it in truly economist terms, people who are young, this generation, and all of us, when we were 22 and 23, we had what's known as low human capital. At that point in your life, your skills are at their lowest. At that point in your life, your experience, by definition, must be at its lowest. So, by definition, you're going to be the least employable just by virtue of who you are in society. A lot of times we focus on ageism and the discrimination that happens once you get older. People tend to focus on that. But if you really look at the numbers, young people are far more discriminated against in the sense that they don't have a lot of human capital. So if I have a choice of people to hire, it's true I can pay the younger one less, but baby, you're going to get what you pay for. And maybe even a little less, won't you? So young people, by their very nature, come into the game with low human capital. But I believe that this generation has even lower human capital than we did, and here's why. We don't make them get jobs, do we? When they're in high school, we tell them to play club soccer and work on your essay for college, and so they come out of school, and yeah, they can play a mean soccer game and write a great essay. But when I see a resume of someone who's never had a job and they're 22 years old, I look and go, I have no idea if you can actually get out of bed in the mornings. I just don't. I have no idea. And so we've all been sort of brought up to think, well, my kids need to do that stuff because it'll help their chances of getting into college. But what are you educating them for? I mean, part of the purpose of education isn't just to get a job. I don't really believe that. Sent my kids to Jesuit school all the way around, and the reason I forked out the money had nothing to do with where I thought it would get them in life. I wanted them to speak Latin for a reason. It has nothing to do with their job. So they can read the Old Testament. It's no, that's not, it's Greek. Okay, crap, I messed up, didn't I? It's not completely the point of education, but I think we've gotten so far away from sort of focusing not on where they'll be at 18, but where they'll be at 25 and 26 and 27. And what makes me even more discouraged about this is when I look at the policies that are on the table, when people start talking about doing something about unemployment, none of them deal with youth unemployment. They do things like extend the length of time that people can collect unemployment benefits, right? I mean, that's a typical solution to deal with unemployment. Well, if they've never had a job, they can't collect unemployment benefits. It doesn't help them. So you're not actually helping the group that, quite frankly, needs it the most. But there's something else at work here as well, and it's particularly important in the financial industry, and that has to do with the increase in the regulatory burden that has happened over the last 15 years. Now, do you notice I'm being very careful in saying it's happened over the last 15 years? Because I'm going to point fingers not at Republicans, not at Democrats, but at everybody. Because here's the deal. The recent passage of Dodd-Frank was 148 pages long. Do you think anybody's read it? I mean, that's longer than like a Russian novel. There's no sex in it. I mean, why would you want to read something 848 pages long? Nobody's read it, not even the people who wrote it, I suspect. Does anybody know how long Glass-Steagall, the act that regulated the financial industry since the Great Depression, how many pages did Glass-Steagall run? Any guesses? 37. So you're all in the ballpark. Yeah, 37 pages as opposed to 848. Now, I don't exactly know the effect that Dodd-Frank will have on the financial industry, but I can give you a few guesses because I was around for Sarbanes-Oxley. If you want to know the chilling effect that Sarbanes-Oxley had on the financial industry in the United States, I'll give you one statistic. In 2001, before Sarbanes-Oxley, in the United States, we accounted for 67% of global IPOs. If you were a company and you were going to go through an initial public offering, our share in the United States of the IPO market was 67%. Do you know what it was last year? Not 67%, not 50, not 40, not 30, not 20. It was 13% last year. Apparently in London, they are considering building a square and putting up 2 enormous statues of Sarbanes and Oxley and saying, thank you, America, for making London's financial industry tick. Because the business ain't happening here, and it's not happening because of Sarbanes-Oxley. It's happening somewhere else. So I don't know the effect of Dodd-Frank, but I can assure you it won't make the system, personally, I don't think it'll make it one bit safer. Not really, not one bit safer, not one bit safer. Because the real problem is this. The real problem comes down to one thing, and it's really just this simple. If too big to fail is the problem, what must be the solution? Never let them get too big. I mean, that's like 5 lines of financial regulation, right? That's it. Nobody ever go for that, will they? But honestly, my friends, it's really just that simple. That's really all that it is. Healthcare regulation, I don't even need to go into that. Because when you think about the burden of regulation in this country, particularly right now, when you don't know what's going to happen, what do businesses do if they can't see into the future clearly? They don't do anything, right? They just stop. They just don't. The worst thing for business is uncertainty. And the regulatory burden that we carry right now produces so much uncertainty that I believe it is largely accountable for much of the unemployment that we are seeing in the United States today. We don't know how much it's going to cost. We don't know how it's going to come down or who's going to be responsible. So businesses go, you know what? I'll just wait. And the longer you wait, the more of an effect it has on the people who are currently unemployed. Dreadful. Which gets us to the last thing I'll talk about, and that is the final E, the election. Now, if you would have asked me a year ago, I would have said, you know, incumbents always have an advantage. They always do. Incumbents always have an advantage. They got name recognition. They've had 4 years in office. You take Osama bin Laden out, how do you lose the U.S. election? I mean, really, how can you lose? That's what I said a year ago. And then I saw 2 things happen. Number one, I realized that 4 years ago in the election, President Obama took the youth vote 3-1. The youth vote came out, all of our kids, that generation, and they came out very strongly and voted for the president 4 years ago. Do you think they're going to come out of their basements and vote this time around? And I can assure you, if it rains that day, they definitely will not. No. They won't be getting out if it rains that day. Second group. 54% of Catholics voted for President Obama in the last election. And you know, I gotta say it, right? Because I'm Catholic, okay? Practicing Catholic, have been for a long time. I went to Mass today down at St. John the Baptist. It's a beautiful cathedral if you get down there to see it. So I can talk about this. Why would you take on the U.S. Conference of Bishops over contraception in an election year? Really? I mean, come on. And everybody says, you know, well, 98% of Catholics use birth control in America. 98% of Catholics lie as well, but they don't think it's right. I mean, how hard is that? How hard would it have been to just wait? I mean, I totally get that immigration thing. Like, that is smart politics. But the U.S. Conference of Bishops? No freaking way. No. Crazy talk. Because, see, here's the deal. This election will be narrow. And you think, oh, no. Oh, yes. I've watched the last few elections. Remember Gore versus Bush? One county in Florida, a couple of hanging chads. The president, the leader of the free world, is coming down to one county. It's coming down to a small number of votes. The question is, can Mitt Romney win? Can he win? Now, I've suggested he not say another word for the next 5 months. Just like go silent. Like, remember Zechariah? I was at John the Baptist. Remember for 9 months of Elizabeth's pregnancy, that guy was mute completely? Remember that? I'm thinking if Romney suddenly finds himself mute, it could be an act of God. I don't know. It might work. By the way, Florida in August, the Republican National Convention, who was their meeting planner? I mean, really? Wow! Somebody ought to be terminated. And I don't mean that in the firing sense of the word. Wow! Oh, my gracious. It'll all come down, I think, to can Romney win? Can he be quiet enough? And can he choose a vice president that doesn't hurt him? Because, see, a vice president's not going to help you. It isn't. But, boy, it can hurt you. Remember Dan Quayle? Remember Dan Quayle? Yeah, remember Dan Quayle? Vice president can hurt you. I don't even need to say it, but I can't help myself. Sarah Palin. I know, because I know you're all thinking, why didn't he just ask her to be vice president? She kind of looks like her anyway, right? I probably, believe it or not, would have been worse for the campaign. Hard to imagine. Hard to imagine. Hard to imagine. But notice how the Romney campaign's throwing some names out and getting them vetted, because it's dangerous to pick someone who hasn't been fully vetted. And politicians at a local level, senators, governors, congressmen, they don't get the scrutiny that you get until you hit the national stage. Bill Clinton, right? Nobody knows until they hit the national stage. And so I do think it's wise right now that you're seeing a little bit of that name dropping. So if there is something nasty and ugly that's going to come out, it goes ahead and hits it beforehand. So it all goes down to the convention. It all goes down to who you choose for vice president. Pick somebody that doesn't hurt you. But the bottom line is this. This summer, you see muddling along of the crisis in Europe. I think you see continued improvement in the United States, but very volatile unnecessarily, punctuated by a lot of uncertainty going into this election that, frankly, I think will really matter for all the reasons that I've laid out. So, with those thoughts in mind, why don't we go ahead and take some questions from the floor? I can take questions here. I can also take questions from the people who are joining us online. I know that there's a way that's been laid out for them to ask questions as well, so feel free to submit questions that way. And I'll take questions from anybody in the audience as well. And I can repeat it back so everybody can hear.
I'm so glad you brought up Dodd-Frank, because I don't think a lot of people in this room are really familiar with that piece of legislation. I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit with the group about what it is, because we're all in the financial and insurance industry, and it's going to have a huge impact, in particular on the insurance sector of the industry in terms of oversight and regulation. And if you could comment on how many government jobs you think it's going to take to do this, and what are those people going to be doing?
Interesting question. How many government jobs do I think it'll take? Well, first of all, let me say, and I talk to people in the financial industry all the time, does anybody think you work in an unregulated industry already? I'm just curious. Does anybody in the financial industry wake up every day and go, I love working in an unregulated industry? I think the bulk of the employment's going to come not from the regulators, but just from the diversion of resources internally that companies are going to have to beef up to comply. That's the problem. And does everybody realize that resources that are devoted to compliance are not inherently productive? I mean, no offense to the compliance people. It's not that they're not valuable, but they are not a profit center, shall we say. That it's like lobbying, right? So lobbying and compliance, those are not activities that are inherently productive. They're just satisfying what I'll call a government beast, okay? So I think the bulk of the job growth, I don't know that Washington sort of beefs up their staff so much as companies are going to have to beef up their staff to deal with, I believe, the 900 new rules that have been written so far. I think it's 900. It's either 700 or 900, but give or take a few hundred. 900 to 700 new rules. Now, what's gotten the most attention when it comes to Dodd-Frank have been the rules around proprietary trading. And how are companies, particularly large, well-integrated banks, going to deal with their hedging activities and all of that? The funny thing is, I'm not so sure these rules change the way that business is done at the banking level so much, for financial industry, and here's why. Here's what I know about companies. They're in the business of maximizing profits. They're going to look at these regulations and continue. They will adjust their business models to deal with them, but there is nothing about them. They're all nitpicky. You know what I'm saying? That when rules are nitpicky, let me give you an analogy, okay? I raised, two kids, the twins. I didn't have a lot of rules in my house. I didn't have specific rules. You could eat in your room, because I eat in my room. We could do things like that. You know, we had dinner together, that kind of thing, but I didn't have a lot of specific rules. What I had were basic guidelines, right? And those guidelines were iron tight. And you could go anywhere within the fence, do whatever you wanted inside the fence, but the penalty for stepping outside the fence was swift and sure and painful. Didn't require a lot of oversight on my part, right? Because I didn't have to worry about what was going on inside the fence. And this is the problem, I believe, with regulations today. We have lost the spirit of regulations, and instead we're trying to sort of micromanage and write down every single thing that a bank can't do, or a financial institution, or any kind of business. Here's the rule. If I would have given my kids a rule that said, you can't drive faster than 55 miles per hour, I can assure you they would have figured out a way to get past it. They would have just put somebody else in the driver's seat and gone 75. So. Well, and this is something that I don't typically name names, but I will name a name in this instance, because I think to some extent he's been sort of pilloried in the press. And so I'll say that I do believe Jamie Dimon is right. This is an industry that's already heavily regulated. If it's already heavily regulated, you could probably enforce the rules, and he probably wouldn't like to hear this. The only other rule I think you really need is never let them get too big. Never let them get too big. He wouldn't like that rule. Notice he doesn't ever talk about that. But never let them get too big. That would take care of what really is the systemic problem. Because you know what? If a bank loses $2 billion, who is that really a problem for? Their shareholders. Who should be mad? Should I be outraged if a financial institution loses $2 billion? I could care less. I feel sorry for their shareholders, but is that a reason to waste a dime of public money, one dime, on a hearing or anything like that? You know, we got real problems in this country, and that's just a circus. When you take an executive of a company and put him on trial for a loss, the only people who should be mad at him are his shareholders. And if they're not mad, they're dumb, and they deserve whatever they get. Now, it's just really, that's how I feel about it. Now, if they are a systemic issue in the sense that institutions' collapse can endanger the whole system, that's a different story. How do you fix that problem? Never let them get too big. I mean, nobody's worried. I don't know, you got anybody worried about the failure of a credit union in the United States, right? I mean, nobody's worried about that. Nobody's hauling the credit union guy up and saying, you know, you lost $20,000 in the last quarter, you know? Nobody does that. It's crazy. It's great. But now you know why I don't get elected. Yeah. Great question. I'm sorry? What's too big? That's a good question. What's too big? You can spend lots of resources figuring that out. But I don't know that it necessarily has to do with asset size. It really has to do with, again, and truly, it's really not just too big, but too connected. That's really the other half of it, too. And I probably should have been a little more explicit. Not just too big, but also too connected. Can regulators figure that out? Well, there's antitrust policy in the United States. A lot of it has to do with market share, more with market share than probably with assets. But when I look at a handful of financial institutions that have the bulk of assets, it's worrisome. That's an issue. And the problem is, what's happened in the financial crisis? Have institutions, the biggest institutions, gotten smaller or larger? Yeah, they've gotten bigger. Like, we've gone the wrong direction. I mean, it's fundamentally a different way of thinking about how the industry is overseen and regulated. But I look and go, over the last 3 years, we've actually made the problem worse rather than better. Now, how do you fix it? My suggestion is this: take advantage of the good times. What we tend to do in a regulatory environment is we go from crisis to crisis. Sarbanes-Oxley was poorly thought out regulation that was put into place in the wake of Enron, right? You got to do something. Well, as we lurch from crisis to crisis, somebody has to wake up and say, that's not the way to regulate any industry. The time to regulate and to think about it is when the times are good, not when the times are bad. Anybody else? Yes, right here. And we only have time for one more, so shoot, make it good. No, it's actually not based on how many people are drawing unemployment. So how do I come up with the unemployment rate of 8.2%, which is where it stands in the United States right now? Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is the body that calculates the unemployment rate, and the way they do it is with a survey. They call people on the phone, and they say, do you have a job? And you answer yes or no. If you answer yes, then you're employed. If you answer no, then they ask you, are you looking for work? And if you're not looking for work, then you're out of the labor force. If you don't have a job and you are looking for work, then you are technically unemployed. Now, this should sort of make your mind say, well, what if somebody becomes discouraged and stops looking, right? They don't count as unemployed, but they're what's known as a discouraged worker, and they have ways of getting at that number as well. When you actually look at the number of people who are unemployed, discouraged, are working part-time and would prefer to work full-time, the rate pops up to about 18%. So the problem is actually much larger depending on how you measure it. But that 8.1% gets bandied about. If you look at the rate of unemployment based on just the number of people collecting unemployment benefits, it's only about 3%. But remember, a big part of the problem is youth unemployment. They don't have unemployment insurance, so they don't ever get into that number. Excellent question. Thank you so much for your attention today. It was a pleasure to be here with you. It was such great fun. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy. Thank you, Marcy. How about another E? Excellent. I learned so much. I learned I can eat in my room, and I shouldn't be angry at my stepson for not having a job. One more time for Marcy Rossell. Well, next up, first of all, I want to remind everybody today is the first day of summer and the longest day of the year. So it's a long day. Next up, enjoy a 30-minute networking break and then the first of your education breakout sessions. Then later this evening, don't forget, we have the welcome reception and dinner hosted by Wild Dunes Resort. As Mary Jane told us, dress appropriately. I don't know if Todd's going to wear a Speedo. No? A thong? But it's on the beach, so I'm always cold, so I'm going to bring a sweater over my gown. I don't like being cold. I can't wait for global warming. Also, I want to remind everybody, tomorrow night's dinner, it's a dine-around, and so there will be a couple of restaurants, and you can sign up for the restaurant that you want in the lobby. Don't forget to do that for tomorrow night's dinner. And we will see you all back here tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., and I hope you enjoy the rest of your long summer day. Thank you so much.